So, arsenic, it was the perfect murder weapon. It was cheap, it was tasteless, untraceable, and you could actually buy it at any grocery store, right next to, like the flour. They called it inheritance powder because the people who used it the most were wives, and those who died from it the most were husbands, and everyone knew it, and nobody could prove literally anything. But the part that doesn't actually make it into all those murder mystery adaptations is that the same poison that Victorian women were slipping into their husbands' tea was also in their wallpaper, their children's toys, their candy, their cosmetics. And this, my friends, is the lore of arsenic. And it is significantly more unhinged than you think, I promise. Hi friends, I'm Betty Rage, and this is Lashes and Lore. And if you're new here, this is where I tell dark stories and we dive deep into the lore that most people try to gloss over. I do all of that while I crochet a blanket. Well, each week I crochet a square for a blanket, and all of the yarn for those blankets comes from sweaters that I have thrifted, unraveled, and now we're making a Frankenstein blanket of it. So yeah, you can check out more about what I do with the thrifted, unraveled sweaters at the link below in my shop called Reanimate Threads. Feel free to join my Patreon where you can discuss more about blankets and sweaters and crochet and D&D and all kinds of stuff if you want. Got my energy drink, and it's time to talk about arsenic. Right. So, first thing that you need to know is that arsenic poisoning is not a Victorian problem. It's ancient. Rome had it, medieval Europe had it. Every civilization that figured out how to extract arsenic from the earth figured out that you could slip it into someone's food and they would die slowly enough that nobody could prove anything. It's been the great equalizer for literally centuries because it didn't care about your social status or your access to weapons. If you had money for arsenic, you had access to power that most people didn't. But let's talk about how it actually works because the chemistry matters. I'm going to sound sort of smart here, and that's only because I did a little research on how arsenic works and what it actually is. Please don't let that fool you into asking me any further questions than what I actually discuss, because that's the extent of my knowledge here. Okay, arsenic. It is a metalloid. That is a fancy way of saying it sits between metals and non-metals on the periodic table. You know, the one you learned about in chemistry in high school. Or if you're still in high school, pay attention in chemistry. Okay? And being a metalloid, it's a very polite way for chemistry to say that this thing does not know what it wants to be. But I like same, arsenic, same. But whatever it is, it's going to destroy your body. It's naturally occurring. You find it in soil, in water, in rocks. Humans have been mining for it for thousands of years because it is useful for a lot of things, like metalwork, glass production, dyes. It's not inherently a poison, just because it exists. The poison part comes when you concentrate it, isolate it, and then put it where it doesn't belong, like in your body. Anyway, in 1775, a Swedish chemist named Carl Scheele figured out how to make a bright, vivid green color using copper arsenite, and he called it Scheele's green, and it was beautiful, luminous. Here's a picture. The kind of green that made you want to have it in your home. And I didn't show off our yarn today. I'm using a black and this green because obviously, why wouldn't I use green if we're literally talking about green and arsenic today? So, okay, back on track now. But it was the kind of green that made you want to have it inside your house, on your walls, on your clothes, everywhere. It was the color of nature, the way nature looked after you filtered it through industrial fantasy. It was also extremely toxic. But Scheele's green was just the beginning. Later, chemists developed an even more vibrant green version called Paris green or emerald green. This one was brighter and more durable, more stable than Scheele's, and it was everywhere. In wallpapers, in paints, in dyes, it became the pigment of choice for artists, manufacturers alike. The pre-Raphaelite movement built itself around those colors, and the artists that were painting some of the most beautiful works of the era were literally poisoning themselves with every single brushstroke. Claude Monet painted his Water Lilies series with pigments containing arsenic compounds. Pierre-Auguste Renoir used arsenic-based greens. And there's evidence to suggest that Van Gogh, even Van Gogh, had arsenic-based paints in his paintings as well. But these weren't accidents. They were the pigments that were available to artists in the 19th century. They mixed them, breathed them in, they wore them on their skin, and nobody told them what they were actually doing to themselves. Paris green was also used as rat poison. So, those people knew. The same green that hung on the walls of Victorian homes and adorned the canvases of master paintings was scattered on your kitchen floor to kill the rodents. It was efficient, it was cheap, and it was literally everywhere. By the time the Victorians got their hands on arsenic, it wasn't just a murder weapon anymore, it was art. It was decoration, and it was industry, and almost nobody saw it coming. Almost. There's always somebody who knows what they're doing. So let's talk about the people who saw arsenic for what it actually was, a tool. Arsenic poisoning has very specific signature. Given in small quantities over time, it produces a gradual decline in health. Symptoms that looked exactly like consumption, cholera, or any number of illnesses that were actively killing people in the Victorian era anyway. A doctor examining a body wouldn't necessarily find anything wrong with the symptoms. They were ambiguous, and the poison was invisible. The motive was often something like insurance money or inheritance, or simply the desire to just be free of a person that you married and couldn't escape. But arsenic's real fame came from something darker. It became the weapon of choice for people with no other choices. This goes back, way back, further than the Victorians. Ancient Rome had arsenic poisoning. Medieval Europe had it. Every era where women had zero legal power, zero access to divorce, zero way out of a marriage, well, they had arsenic, and it was cheap. Like I said, next to the flour at the grocery store. You could buy it at an apothecary. It was tasteless. You could slip it into food, and nobody would know. And it worked slowly enough that by the time the symptoms showed, the connection to the person who had actually handled the food was really long gone. And like I said before, the Victorians called it inheritance powder because that's what it was. A woman married a man that she despised or feared, or he was beating her, and she fed him arsenic in his tea until he died. And she inherited his money and finally had access to her own life. It was murder, technically. But it was also the only power most of these women would ever have. Arsenic poisoning became so common that they had a phrase for it. The golden age of poisoning. Yep, specifically, Mary Ann Cotton murdered her mother, 3 husbands, a lover, and 11 of her children. That's an example of getting a little bit out of control here. All of that was for insurance payouts. She was just the one that they caught, and we all remember. There were hundreds of others who never got caught at all. Everyone knew it was happening. Like, doctors knew, the wealthy knew. There were barely any tests to detect it, which meant the only way to prosecute was if you had absolute proof. And the absolute proof almost never existed. So women kept poisoning husbands, and husbands kept poisoning wives, and children kept poisoning their parents. And the system just allowed it to happen. Stopping it would have required admitting how broken everything actually was. Arsenic has always been the weapon of the desperate. The Victorians just made a record of it. But the thing about arsenic, once you figure out how to make a vivid green color with it, you don't just use it for poison, you use it for everything. And by the mid-1800s, arsenic wasn't just in the hands of murderers, it was in your home, on your walls, in your clothes, on your children, on the easels of the greatest artists of the century. Scheele's green and Paris green became the most fashionable colors in the world. Brilliant, luminous emerald. The pre-Raphaelite movement built itself around it. And then we have William Morris, the most famous wallpaper designer of the era. And you got to remember, wallpaper was a big deal. What is happening here? Have I not made a corner? I didn't. We have to go back and make a corner. I got too excited about arsenic. What? Maybe I'll sit on this foot, though. I'm usually not too short for things, but I can't find a setup that I'm not too short for at the moment. Okay. William Morris, the most famous wallpaper designer of the entire era, he created patterns using arsenical greens that sold by literal the millions. One manufacturer actually estimated that by the 1850s, nearly 100 million square miles of arsenical wallpaper existed in British homes alone. Another vendor claimed that he was using up to 2 tons of Scheele's green every week just to meet the demand for Christmas tree green wallpaper. But wallpaper was just the beginning. Women wore dresses dyed with arsenic. They wore artificial flowers in their hair dyed with arsenic. They applied arsenic cosmetics directly to their skin. Men wore green waistcoats and neckties colored with arsenic, and children played with toys painted in arsenical greens. Mothers bought feeding bottles marketed as modern marvels that were painted with arsenic. And these bottles had names like the Little Cherub and the Princess. Mothers loved them. It was a source of pride that their infant could feed themselves. Vegetables were, they were sprayed with arsenic-based pesticides. Meat was dipped in arsenic to keep flies away. Poison will do that. Candy was colored bright green with arsenic. And even postage stamps had arsenic in the adhesive. For all you youngins out there, before we had stickers, there was adhesive on the back of a stamp that you had to lick in order for it to stick to the envelope. So, you could lick a stamp and ingest arsenic. Candles, wallpaper, beer, wine, wrapping paper, stuffed animals, ornaments. Arsenic was literally everywhere because it was cheap and it made colors that people wanted. They wanted to buy it and they wanted to display it. And the people selling it knew exactly what it was. The only thing most Victorians didn't realize was that they were slowly poisoning themselves and their children just by living in their homes. So the artists didn't realize that they were poisoning themselves with every single painting, and the families didn't realize that the beauty on their walls were literally toxic. But the manufacturers knew, and they did not care because they got to make money off of it. So obviously the people started to get sick. And in 1858, The Lancet published a story about a 3-year-old boy who died after eating pigment that flaked off of the wallpaper in his nursery. A couple in Birmingham applied bright green wallpaper to 2 rooms of their house and immediately suffered headaches, inflamed eyes, and sore throat. And then their pet parrot got sick too. One morning in 1879, a visiting dignitary who had stayed at Birmingham Palace was so ill from the arsenic wallpaper that he was late to his meeting with Queen Victoria herself. 4 children in East London tore down their home's arsenic green wallpaper to lick it, and all 4 of them died. Doctors started to raise alarms. A prominent doctor from that time, Thomas Orton, nursed a family through a mysterious sickness. One by one, all 4 of the children died. He started taking notes about everything in their home. The water supply was clean. The house was clean. And the only thing that he found wrong was that the wallpaper in the bedroom was bright green. And when the doctors began publishing warnings about the arsenic in wallpaper, manufacturers, they pushed back hard. William Morris, the man whose designs had made arsenical wallpaper famous, dismissed the warnings entirely. He wrote to a friend that the doctors were bitten, as people were bitten, with witch fever. In other words, it was hysteria. Superstition, the same kind of panic that had driven witch trials. It wasn't hysteria. 4 children had died in one family alone, and others were getting sick, but Morris had too much to lose. His wallpaper business made him very wealthy, and his family's arsenic mine, yep, they had an arsenic mine. Devon's Great Consols was one of the largest producers of arsenic in the entire world. That mine contained enough arsenic to kill every creature on the planet. And Morris made most of his money from it. So he called the doctors hysterical and kept selling wallpaper. The manufacturers knew what was happening. They knew arsenic was toxic. They'd known it for centuries. But the profit was far too good to question. So they kept producing it. They kept marketing it, and they kept dismissing the warnings as superstition and witch fever. Yeah, okay. And families kept getting sick. Children kept dying, and nothing changed because the people in power didn't want to change. And I bet you can figure out where I'm going with this. So, arsenic wallpaper was never formally banned. There was no law against it, no government mandate, no official decree that said, stop poisoning your children. No, change came because the consumers stopped buying it. Women managing their households looked at their sick children, listened to what people were saying, made the connection that doctors had been screaming about for years, and they stopped. They took the wallpaper down. They started buying from manufacturers that guaranteed arsenic-free products. So by the end of the 19th century, production of arsenical, that's a hard one for me to say. So, by the end of the 19th century, production of the arsenical wallpaper had completely ceased. William Woolham's & Co., a London-based wallpaper firm, stopped producing arsenical wallpapers in 1859, early, before anyone else. They were awarded a gold medal in recognition of their services to public welfare. Not for discovering arsenic was poison, that wasn't the news, but for actually listening when people said, oh, hey, we don't really want that in our homes anymore, and actually changing what they made the wallpaper out of. And the manufacturers that refused to stop using arsenic lost business. Consumers took their money elsewhere. Within a generation, the industry reformed itself through collective refusal. And if you haven't made this connection yet, I'm going to make it real clear for you. Right now, there are 130 million households in the United States. The Fortune 500 list has 500 companies. That means you outnumber them 260,000 to 1. Every single time you buy something, you're voting for what gets made next. Every time you don't buy something, you're voting against it. We, collectively, have more power than any corporation, any manufacturer, and any institution trying to sell us something that we don't need. And once upon a time, we proved it with arsenic. We stopped buying the green, and the green stopped being made. That power is still yours. And, you know, as one of my favorite bands in the entire world, Rage Against the Machine, once said, take your power back. Arsenic was literally everywhere in the Victorian era because people wanted it to be, because it was beautiful and cheap, and nobody in power was willing to admit that beauty had a cost. The doctors screamed about it, the children died from it, and nothing changed until people buying it decided to stop buying it. William Morris called the warnings witch fever. He had too much to lose. His wallpaper business, his arsenic mine, his wealth, God forbid. So he dismissed the truth and kept selling poison, and people kept buying it until they realized what was actually happening in their homes. So that's the lore. That's arsenic. That's the history. That's what happens when you have something beautiful and toxic and profitable, and you get to decide whether it stays or whether it goes. We decided it did not need to stay. And if you want to read more about this subject, James C. Wharton's The Arsenic Century, How Victorian Britain Was Poisoned at Home, Work, and Play, is the definitive text on this subject, in my opinion. Here is our arsenic-laced square from today's episode. I really like the way that one looks. So obviously you have to comment the word green to let me know you made it through the end of this video. And if you want to support this channel, my Patreon is linked below. You just can't get enough of me, which I mean, who can? Really. I'm Betty Rage, your favorite nerdy goth mom, and this was Lashes and Lore. Don't forget, take your power back. Be good to each other, love each other, and as always, free mom hugs from me to you. Take a look at this one next.